Rappin with ReefBum is sponsored by Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine.
Hey, what's happening, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Rappin with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Craig Bingman to the show. What's happening there, Craig?
Just got back from work. The usual frantic, trying to pick up my kid and get home, and so slid in here right at the last.
Well,
second.
I guess you had a pretty good excuse. You said there was a train blocking you from getting home.
There was actually a train.
But you made it, and we're really psyched to have you on the show. Just for those folks that don't know Craig, he is a scientist and one of the earliest pioneers of the saltwater aquarium hobby, who was honored with the 2019 MASNA Award for his foundational role in understanding the chemical processes in aquariums. He has helped countless hobbyists overcome challenges with water chemistry in reef tanks and helped pave the way for some of the most common reef tank additives we still use today. Craig was a contributing author to the Aquarium Frontiers article series that proved to solve some of the most critical problems facing reef aquarists in the 1990s. He is a frequent speaker at conferences and shows and what have you, so I'm really psyched to have Craig on tonight. Before we start chatting with Craig, though, I do want to thank the sponsors for this live stream, both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine. Appreciate these companies supporting the stream, and I also really appreciate all you folks out there tuning in and watching. Please spread the word, hit that like button so more people can find this stream. And as always, I encourage you folks to drop questions and comments in the chat. I do have some questions that I have in the can for Craig, but we could certainly pivot to other things that you folks are interested in talking about. So, Craig, I mentioned that I saw you speak last year at MASNA in Milwaukee, and you gave a talk about lime water. So I kind of thought it would be cool to dig into some reef tank chemistry stuff and talk about alkalinity and calcium, and then kind of get into the kalkwasser stuff, lime water stuff. You know, so
Sure.
there's various ways, right, to maintain calcium and alkalinity in a reef tank. You can use 2-part additives or 3-part if you're dosing, I guess, magnesium. You can use a calcium reactor. I mentioned calc wasser. So those are all methods to supplement alkalinity and calcium. You know, you hear the term a lot in the hobby about.
So
Go ahead.
I guess to add to that list, there's actually the 1-part calcium alkalinity supplements, and the one that we thought about the most a while ago is probably calcium acetate, but more recently people have been using calcium formate for that purpose. So that's another. There's 1, 2, and 3-part systems now for maintaining calcium and alkalinity.
What I mean, in terms of the 1, 2, and 3-part, obviously you have more flexibility with the more parts. Is that a big inherent advantage with going 1-part versus 2 versus 3-part, that you have more control?
There's a couple of different 1-part systems. I guess I would probably say that lime water was, even before calcium acetate, was the original, uni-area 1-part system for doing that, because it delivers calcium and alkalinity in the correct proportions. The advantages are, and calcium reactors, I guess you could also say, since there's one stream coming out, is also kind of a 1-part, you don't have
Right.
to segregate the chemistry. And then there's the ionic systems, like the ionic and C balance for the 2-part systems that are the oldest, I think. And there's some other ones that have come along since then. And then the 3-part systems, which were derived from, I think the original inspiration was from Tropic Barren. They were trying to figure out how to get saltwater, seawater mixes transported most economically. And they decided that they could locally source the sodium chloride, because it's a majority of the mass. So then they had a mix that was basically seawater except for sodium chloride. And then one of the chemists figured out that you could use calcium chloride and sodium bicarbonate and basically generate the missing sodium chloride in the system, and then turn that into a 3-part system where the third component was a balancing brine. And yeah, that's where most of the magnesium is. But whether or not those systems are tuned to deliver a little bit of extra magnesium to cover the magnesium loss in reef aquariums is another question, right? That's an open question. If you use that 3rd part to bump up magnesium, it gets complicated, because so none of the balance systems are. It's not exactly like a contract, that I'm able to sign in blood that it's going to keep your chemistry balanced in your aquarium, because there's other things that can disturb that balance. So nitrification generates protons, right? So that can deplete alkalinity. So if you have nitrate building up in your aquarium, that will definitely cause alkalinity to drop and calcium to go down. And no one really knows, there's no universal ratio of calcium and magnesium that's right to support calcification in reef aquariums. It really depends on what's in the system. And so you can't make one supplement that's going to be perfect for everything. And people try to, kind of like deliver the best that they can. And then you'll have to do some adjustments at the edges. But that covers up the fact that these systems are so much better than what existed in the hobby when I first got involved thinking about chemistry, which was literally people going out and buying, they had their box of Arm & Hammer sodium bicarbonate, and they'd acquired some calcium chloride somewhere, maybe snow melt, maybe something a little bit better than that. And they were just like chucking this stuff in their aquarium. Sometimes they would put it in a solution, other times they would just let it dissolve in the system. And so the calcium and alkalinity was just like all over the map when they did that. They weren't adding it in the correct proportions, right? And so one of the first things that I did was just suggest that people make two solutions, one with calcium and the other with alkalinity, that were in approximately the correct proportions, and then add equal amounts of those two. So that was initially a very, very simple system. It was just 1 molar sodium bicarbonate and half molar calcium chloride. But even that was a lot better than what people were doing to that point, which was just pure chaos. So they would have these wild, excursions in calcium and alkalinity. And then, I remember this one guy in particular, his name was Anthony, and he was always having snowstorms in his system. So he would, put in too much stuff and it would just wipe out. And a bunch of stuff would precipitate, and corals don't like that at all, right? So all of those systems can provide a much more kind of like chill aquarium experience, and reduce the amount of testing that you have to do really dramatically, like more than an order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude. It's just like, these people were just testing every day and were not able to stabilize the system.
So Intrinsic Reef, thank you so much for that super chat. I really appreciate that. The comments, this stream is one of the best sources of information in the hobby right now. Thank you. Keep up the legendary interviews. Well, we're doing so with Craig on the stream. So, Craig, you hear the term chasing alkalinity a lot in this hobby, and so people are focusing, when you hear that term, the focus is on alkalinity, maybe not as much on calcium and magnesium. Is that a prudent thing to do in terms of just kind of shooting for a certain level of alkalinity, letting calcium and magnesium kind of fall where they may within a certain range? Is that a way to keep a reef tank that is gonna end up in success or not?
So alkalinity is the fastest moving parameter, right? So it's limiting of those three. A super fast calcifying aquarium can basically run out of alkalinity in the course of a single day. It can go from adequate to levels where it's so low that it's really limiting the rate of calcification in the system. And for shallow tanks with really good light and water motion and a bunch of corals, you can contrive a system where, if you look at the rate of depletion, you would actually go negative. Not that that's physically possible, but it means that the system is capable of using more alkalinity than exists in the water at any given time in the course of a single day. So you have to continuously supplement a system like that, because alkalinity is the one that runs short fastest. That's really the one that you have to watch the most closely to make sure that it's stable. But you do kind of have to watch the other two, because I'm not sure what people mean by kind of like intolerance, but if you don't pay any attention to the other two, you can wind up either seriously low or high with one or both of them, depending on other stuff that's happening with the aquarium. So it's like, there's a little chase on alkalinity. It's the one that's kind of like the sentinel parameter that tells you that you need to increase or decrease the tempo of balanced supplementation. But you have to watch the other stuff too. If you don't have enough magnesium in the water, the buffer system, the carbonate buffer system, doesn't work as well, and you can actually lose effective buffering capacity and get more radical pH swings then. And if you don't watch calcium, it can actually crawl up to really high levels. If you've got nitrification in your system, it will just keep, and you're using a system that's delivering calcium carbonate and not a calcium magnesium carbonate, effective final product, it will just creep up over time, and it will get high enough that it puts you actually at some risk of having one of these precipitation events, because whoa, I didn't realize that my calcium was up to 700, and that means that the amount of alkalinity that you need to have in the water at a given pH to just cause things to completely wipe out is almost just half as much as it would be with a normal calcium level in your aquarium. So you have to watch.
What would you say is a safe range for calcium in terms of a low and a high? When you start going below a certain level and above a certain level, when you should be concerned for calcium. And I'll ask you the same question for magnesium.
Well, so I think that you really ought to aim to keep within 10% of natural seawater values for both of those. There's no reason not to. That's assuming that you've got a salinity of 35 in your system, so full strength seawater. And so I don't know. You can get by certainly if you've got typical salinity with calcium is in the 350 range. That works. People will run up to 500 in some cases. As nearly as I can tell, there's no advantage to running higher than natural seawater calcium concentrations. And similarly with magnesium, you want to be in the 1300, 1400 range. Some people will let it dip down to 1200 ppm. I'm using the parts per million standard that most people usually use. I think it's more like, I won't do the molar stuff, but I don't think that, similarly with magnesium, I don't know that there's any conspicuous advantage to trying to run it higher than natural seawater magnesium values either. Your sea surface seawater on a coral reef is typically supersaturated with respect to calcium carbonate. So you've got a lot of that stuff in the water if your pH values are reasonable. So there's no point in going too high, and the chemistry starts to get a little bit weird when those values get too low as well. So plus or minus 10%.
Gotcha. So what about the variability of alkalinity? You hear a lot people say that alk swings can be the cause of certain issues with, let's say, SPS in terms of an aquapore showing signs of stress. How important is it to keep a stable DKH and alkalinity level in a reef tank?
So I think that with calcium and magnesium, as far as the biological uptake pathways for those, they're pretty well along the towards being saturated. So small changes in those parameters aren't going to affect what's available to the organism to take up in any significant way. Whereas alkalinity is, if alkalinity, the organisms will feel that, and they will have twice as much alkalinity available to them, and that means something, because that system is typically not as saturated as calcium and magnesium. So swings in those and that's actually a very biologically active component too. It doesn't just participate in skeleton formation. It's also available to the symbiotic algae inside corals as well. So there's one of the things that calcification does is it basically if you have bicarbonate in the water, it gives you a proton and it frees a carbon dioxide. So you put away a carbonate, start out with 2 bicarbonates, more or less, and you put away a carbonate, and then that gives you a free CO2 that can go into photosynthesis. So that's one of the things that the animals can one of the things that the coral system gives out of it, and it's an advantage that corals have, and it's an advantage that coralline algae have over animals that are not animals, organisms that are dependent on carbon dioxide only for photosynthesis, because there's a lot more bicarbonate in seawater than there is free CO2 on a molar basis. So there's a lot of bicarbonate, just a little bit of free CO2. So if your alkalinity situation is not great, you may tip, if the system is not poised to calcify, you can easily have the system tip over into other modes where like green algae are dominant, as opposed to the pink algae and living corals. So that's one, when I was doing chemistry early on, that was one thing that I saw in a lot of cases, is that systems that did have a lot of problems with hair algae often would have inadequate, like lower than seawater alkalinity levels. And that low alkalinity also, I think, can let the saturation of the system go down, and can let mineralized phosphate go back into the water column where stuff can start using it. So there's a lot of compelling reasons to keep your calcium and alkalinity in reasonable values. And when it drops, the organisms, the calcifying organisms feel it, I think. It can mean that the feedstock for photosynthesis is changing by a factor of 2 or a factor of 3 over the course of a single day. And photosynthesis is it's a vital thing, but it's also kind of like catching lightning or handling fire. You're potentially generating radicals, or you are generating some radicals in the system. And if the organisms, like expectations for raw materials for photosynthesis aren't met or changing wildly, then the photosynthetic system can start causing damage to the organism as well. So I do think that there's definitely something to tip burn and that kind of stuff in corals where the alkalinity is, even higher than is expected, can also have an impact on photosynthesis as well. So
would you
stable's good if you can pull that off.
What would you define as stable? You hear a lot about alkalinity being in the 7 to 11 DKH range as being within an acceptable range for that parameter. In terms of variability, what would you say within if that is indeed an acceptable range? What within that range in terms of variability?
So that wouldn't be an ideal range to see over a single day. That's
right.
For sure, right? So operationally, I don't know at what point the alkalinity can actually change a little bit even on the water flowing over shallow reefs. There's an alkalinity defect that's caused by calcification, which is measurable by chemical oceanographers, right? So they can actually measure the calcification rate of the reef ensemble by measuring the alkalinity of the water, before it hits and after it comes out the other side. Yeah, in terms of like DKH values, if you can get the variability less than 1 over the course of a day, I think that would be peachy keen. Obviously, when I was keeping aquariums, they would vary more than that. Was that ideal? Probably not. I mean, we didn't have the tools, the measurement tools and control tools that people have available to them now.
Well, so what are your thoughts about alkalinity monitors and actually having those control your calcium and alkalinity within the tank?
I think that so I'm a chemist, so I think more knowledge about chemistry is almost always a good thing. It almost never you can arrange to have it hurt you if you do the wrong things with the information, right? But so I think that they're fantastic. They're expensive, but if you can swing it, it's a fantastic tool. And I think that you can really learn with one of those monitors just by watching the system. You can arrange to have demonstrated for you what I've been telling people about for the last 30 years or something, about how much variability you can have in the course of a single day in alkalinity in your system, right? And that's kind of like a big wake-up call, I think, for people when they actually see that. I feel about control the same way that I feel about controlling anything else. It's like I think that people would do well to figure out how to run a simple system with no control before they dive off into something with control. And if you've got just a simple, kind of like mixed soft and stony coral reef tank, something that's a little chill in terms of calcification rate, and just figure out how to run a system like that before you spend $10,000 on a balls to the wall automated, really complicated system. If people can afford that kind of system, I think it's fantastic. And I always like to see people spending money in the industry, right? Because it's a good thing in general. And it helps push technology forward, and it helps keep the vendors supplying interesting products for us to use. But you don't want to have this really complicated system and not understand how the pieces are really working and what the underlying rates really ought to be. So before you put a controller on a system, you got to figure out how to get that parameter almost dialed in, on your own with dosing or something like a dosing pump or manual dosing. And then you know what the expectation is. So then you can set your controller to deliver sane amounts of that material to the system. So people with controllers get in trouble when they're expecting, a lot of the limiting valves or limiting, whatever for either flow of supplements into the system or carbon dioxide into a CO2, calcium carbonate CO2 reactor, right? So if you're not close with the way you've adjusted your needle valve, and your CO2 delivery system can dump 20 times as much carbon dioxide into that reactor than you need in the course of a day, then you are one problem with that solenoid valve or whatever from destroying your aquarium. It's a single point of failure. You haven't done anything to isolate yourself from it, and your stuff is going to die. So
yeah, I'm an advocate of using those tools for monitoring purposes and not necessarily for controlling. I just others have the same point of view that the more different variables that are in play, there's more points of failure, and that can lead to some unwanted consequences.
Yeah, well, I think that, so I'm kind of I'm okay with controlling this stuff, but you really got to know what you signed up for, and you've got to know what the downsides are to all the points of failure that can happen in the system. And Sanjay actually does really nice talks about this, and I've known Sanjay forever. We talked about this kind of stuff since I was in New York, and he would come in, drive into the city, and we'd go grab Indian food, and if you lean too much on the control and you don't understand what the proper adjustment of that valve or whatever would be without a controller on the system, your stuff's going to die. It's just a matter of when.
So you mentioned carbon dioxide, and Jason Langer has a really good question, so we've had wildfires in Canada, and the smoke is seeping down into parts of the United States. So his question is,
it's been awful here in Madison.
Oh, yeah.
So we were up in the whatever the units are. We're up in over 300,
Wow.
which is in the you're going to die if you go outside.
That's not a good situation. So his question is, with the recent poor air quality, what effects could we see to our reef tank? I draw outside air to boost pH, but many are seeing pH depressed when the smoke is bad. Any other concerns?
So I don't think that the smoke depressed pH when the smoke is bad. That's really interesting. So the amount of burning has not changed the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, appreciably from the standpoint of reef aquarium husbandry. If it had, then we would have even worse problems than we have now. I have been wondering though what effect all this other crap in the air might be having on our systems, because we don't know what a lot of these organics, might do in a marine system. We have the mystery of people's corals will get sick every spring. Now, what's up with that? But I suspect that it's actually something related to the ground thawing out, and some either nitrogen or other volatile, nitrogen oxide kind of compounds popping up. And a bunch of that stuff is fairly potent messenger molecules, diffusible messenger molecules in biological systems. So it may just be that, you're getting in the spring, the corals are getting, a signal to die basically from the air. And there may be some like increased carbon monoxide or something like that may have a negative effect on our systems as well, in addition to who knows what these other organics are doing. So if you can filter the air that you're drawing from the outside as much as possible, I think that's a great thing to do. And it's a great thing to try to keep the air in your house as clean as possible as well. I mean, I think everyone many people made a fairly substantial investment in indoors during COVID. And, I flipped all that stuff on when the smoke started coming in, and that's good for people. And it can't be bad for your aquariums either, to keep the air in the
Yeah. Jason adds, when the smoke was terrible, I noticed that my nitrate jumped for 2 days when I anticipated them to going down.
So I think that there may be, the stuff that comes off of fires potentially has very potent signaling molecules in it, and the system may be responding to it, and you may see organisms not doing their job as well as they normally would. So it's not completely surprising to me that pH might change. Maybe photosynthesis is depressed in the system, or something else is going on. Not completely surprising that these sort of external insults would wind up magnified in a reef aquarium. I mean, one of the cool things about reef aquariums, from my perspective, is that they are like amplifiers for the chemistry that's happening in aquatic systems. Just because you've got everything really confined in a small volume of water, so whatever chemical changes happen in the ocean or in nature are just amplified by the smallness and of the system, and it makes it a lot easier to figure out what's going on. So, maybe there's some experiments out there for people to try to start bleeding in some of these controlled amounts of some of these potential diffusible signaling molecules into reef aquariums and see what happens.
Interesting. So, all right, we've been talking about alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, some carbon dioxide talk there about how its impact on pH. Let's talk about pH, and it's important in terms of keeping a reef tank. And John Wright has this question. I had the question myself in my notes. John Wright says, Chris Meckley says alkalinity isn't as important as pH. I'm confused. Do we need to check both regularly? So, what he's referring to there is, you don't necessarily need to chase the alkalinity, chase the pH, so you can achieve an elevated pH for your tank, and that will lead to increased growth and what have you, and have a lot of benefits. So, what's your thought in terms of chasing pH versus focusing on alkalinity?
This all reminds me of those, what are they, Bud Light commercials where people were like, taste great, less filling, and they're like gonna like beat each other up over it. Both can be true at the same time, right? So, or not, I suppose, in the case of a certain beverage that was being advertised. So, both pH and alkalinity are important, and I would leave it there, and have left it there for my whole career, basically. And the reason that I want to leave it that way is because, okay, so let's say that pH is the most important thing, and I have whatever the perfect value of pH is supposed to be this week, 8.5, right? But I only have an alkalinity of one DKH. I don't think my aquarium is going to be very happy,
No.
even though I have the perfect pH, right? So, and let's say that I have the perfect alkalinity value, whatever that's supposed to be this week, right? Or whoever you're talking to, wherever you're talking to somebody, and the pH in the aquarium is 6.5. Well, I don't think that's going to work out very well either, right? So clearly, both of these parameters are important, and if you're doing sane things as far as supplementing, calcium and alkalinity, you'll usually get them to kind of like fall into some sort of, reasonable parameter space. I do think that pH may have been a little bit neglected. Maybe it did need a little bit more love than it was getting. But it's been getting love for a long time. So when I was over at Greg Scheimer's house back in the 90s, and we would all get together and look at, Greg Scheimer had some incredible aquariums. And he had probably 20 or 30 people over at his house. And we're all down in the basement. And we're all very, breathing hard because we're looking at pretty corals. And so the pH in his aquariums just started like bottoming out. I mean, like was dropping like a rock, and Greg was like really alarmed that someone had done something to his aquariums, right? Just like because you hear about people doing that kind of stuff in pet stores, this, poisoning systems just to be just to
For the sake,
be,
yeah,
basically,
yeah.
And I'm like, how many people are here? What's the volume of the basement? I'm like, I think it's carbon dioxide. I think we're all just making enough carbon dioxide down here that it's, and this was a really long time ago before people had CO2 monitors that were, ubiquitously available as they are now. You can go on Amazon, buy a CO2 monitor for not very much money. And our houses have become very, very tight, very well insulated, as they become more energy efficient. And indoor carbon dioxide levels have gone up. And it's not good for the aquariums. I guess unless you've got a planted tank, then that would be good, right? Because they're always worried about losing carbon dioxide. And it's not good for people either. It's not, because you start to feel sleepy and not well above a certain point. when I was in graduate school, you know, there was like, I can't remember what day was it. Monday. It's either Monday. I think it's Monday. At 4 p.m., everybody would go down to the seminar room, and it was like the speaker of the week, right? And you know, I'd make it about 20 minutes into it, and there was like the makeup air in that room was really bad, and I'm like just about ready to like pitch over, just because of the amount of carbon dioxide. So it will make you feel unwell in your own home. So if you are guided to increase the amount of makeup air in your house and make it healthier that way, by chasing pH in your aquarium, I think that that's probably a good thing. But you know, you could do that anyway. You could get a you know, one of these cross current ventilation systems for your HVAC, and have better air for your family all the time. It decreases radon in your house, and it decreases the amount of organics that are floating around, that are outgassing off of, you know, virtually everything that people make now. So.
Yeah, I actually have a, well, I guess what's called an air exchange unit. So, you know, that
Yep.
that in the wintertime, that helped. You know, I live in Vermont, and so in the wintertime, my windows are just shut really tight. So having that air exchange,
Absolutely.
yeah, having that air exchange unit, I think it raised my pH like 0.2 pH points, which is pretty significant.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You know, so all right. So speaking of pH and elevated pH and what have you, I don't know if I mentioned that you gave a talk at MASNA. I guess I did mention you gave a talk at MASNA about lime water, and so, you know, lime water kalkwasser has made a it seems like a big resurgence among reef keepers over the past I don't know how many years, but it's
Right.
it's being utilized by a lot more folks. So, you know, there's a lot of nuances I find in terms of you know, using kalkwasser, lime water. A lot of questions that I think are interesting. Like, you know, you hear about, and you mentioned this in your talk, using pickling lime or food grade, you know, calcium hydroxide, you know, that it's cheap,
Right.
what have you. How important is the quality, the grade of the lime water that you're using? Can you get by with the pickling lime, or does it make sense if you want to invest the money in high grade, you know, kalkwasser? Would that be a better way to go?
So when you mix calcium hydroxide, um, you will precipitate some possible impurities in the system. So if you dispense clarified lime water, the clear product, not the turbid stuff on the bottom or the film that occurs on the top, you'll have a lot less of certain impurities. So there's I shouldn't say all, many of the like heavy metal compounds that might be there often have really insoluble hydroxide salts, and they're gone. They're at the bottom of the basin. Um, Magnesium is really insoluble at lime water pH. So there's no magnesium that will come into your system if you're dosing calcium hydroxide through dosing clarified lime water. I remember that a long time ago, somebody had a product where they were putting, it was supposed to be a mixture of calcium hydroxide and magnesium hydroxide. And that was just like, you know, dude, you need to figure out some chemistry before you start selling stuff to people. So that didn't last very long. I think I did that to it enough that it went away, and people don't do that anymore. But that's, you know, and I think that's actually also part of the reason why it was reputed early on that dosing lime water would cause magnesium to precipitate out of your system. And as nearly as I can tell, unless you have one of the wipeout events that I showed in my MASNA talk, where you put in so much that you're actually making magnesium hydroxide form, that the magnesium drops that people were seeing were really just from coral and algae growing in the aquariums. So redirect me to your original question. I think I've kind of gotten off in the weeds here.
Does a higher grade of calc matter?
So I think it depends. One of the things that the lower grades of lime water probably have in more abundance is some silica. And you can have a couple of different opinions about that. I've always been of the opinion that's kind of a good thing because it promotes the growth of diatoms in your aquarium over other stuff. And you know, diatoms are the grass of the sea. So if you're going to have any algae besides symbiotic algae in your corals, and maybe pink coralline algae, if you like that, I certainly do. Diatoms are my next choice because the snails eat them. You know, the comb-toothed tangs and blennies and everybody eats diatoms. And yeah, they grow in your glass. You know, the solution to that is as simple as that, and then they're gone. But certainly lower grades of lime water could have more silica, and high pH will solubilize the silica in the product pretty effectively. So that's one thing that could show up in a lower grade of lime water. There's some other stuff that doesn't follow the rules of insoluble hydroxide. So if there was maybe arsenic or some other stuff that has kind of an anionic hydrolysis form in water, you might get some impurities like that in the system as well. But settled lime water is kind of a self-purifying system in a lot of regards. So that's why people can get by with the lower grades of lime. Certainly there's like, if you can afford the higher grade stuff, I don't think you're going to hurt yourself, right? And you can have more certitude and maybe lower diatom growth if that's important to you as well. But I've managed aquariums with you know, food grade lime in the past, and that's worked out. That worked out okay for me. So
you mentioned impurities a couple of times, you know, and is the big fear that the impurities will be in the sediment, and that the sediment is something that it could potentially leach into the lime water itself? And
yeah, so
okay.
There are some people who are like intentionally dosing cloudy lime water.
Slurry, you're talking about?
Slurry, or maybe not quite even that dense. Just like it's still cloudy, so to increase the concentration of it. Everything that I just said about, you know, stuff precipitating out, you just like forget about all that. You're getting everything, you know, that's in the lime in the system that way. And so for cases like that, it may be justified to use a higher grade of calcium hydroxide, just because you can't lean on these like self-purifying properties of settled lime water.
If you're using whether it's a calc stirrer or a you know, a container that has the lime water in it with the sediment, you know, on the bottom, how often would you recommend changing out that sediment to avoid any you know, thing bad happening in terms of, you know, some of those impurities leaching out into the system? Is that something that should be done every couple of months? Should you not worry about it?
Oh, I'd clean it out every couple of months for sure, for a couple of reasons. I mean, there's a bunch of bad stuff that's laying around at the bottom of it, and you've also probably getting an increasing amount of undissolved calcium hydroxide down there as well. And so if you have any glitch in your technical system that causes that sediment to be put into your aquarium, the yield of the nuclear bomb that goes off is just increasing the more of that kind of sludge that you have down at the bottom of your system. So.
Does that suggest that the folks that do the calc slurry dosing are kind of playing a little Russian roulette?
So, and I mentioned my talk. So there's like thinking about the talk, and before I hadn't really looked at it since I gave the talk, and I thought since I was going to talk with you, I better remember what it was that I said. And then I remembered that the QR codes were broken, and I tried to update all that stuff. So at some point, I've got to like update all the QR codes. But one of the talks that I linked out to was the MASNA Award for Alf Nielsen. And very early on, he recognized the limitations of lime water, right? So saturated lime water can you're limited by evaporation how much of that you can put in your aquarium. And if you've got a lot of corals and you don't have very much evaporation, you can wind up short, right? So his solution was, and I think Alf was really the first person who did all this like stirring stuff and separate carbon dioxide injection for pH control. That kind of a system does overcome those limitations of lime water. And you're in a control situation then, because the pH is usually being actively controlled, and everything that we just said about control systems begins to apply, right? So get a CO2 cylinder, and if it all dumps in your aquarium, everything's dead. And if it runs dry and you're still pumping a bunch of calcium hydroxide in your system, then the pH is going to go really high, right? So you've got to like really watch this stuff very, very carefully and make sure that, or if the pH, if your system even has some protections built into it, then the lime water slurry will shut off and your system won't have any alkalinity going into it anymore. And then you're less than a day away from a crash there if you're in like one of these top light, top flow, reef aquariums. And I likened to this like grabbing a tiger by the tail, and people really have done that. When you want to crowd that much coral into a glass box and have it grow the way that it does for us. Corals in our aquariums grow the same as they do in the wild, if not maybe a little bit faster. They probably make more progress because stuff's not bothering them, not eating it as much in a healthy reef aquarium than it is in the wild. It's not being tormented by butterfly fish coming by and pecking at it and stuff like that. So our systems corals can grow at phenomenal rates in reef aquariums. And what can I say? You signaled your willingness to endure this. When you spent all that money on the system, you got involved with the hobby. So it's hard. What can I say? It's still not foolproof. It's still not. Even the most experienced people in the hobby continue to find, creative ways that they personally haven't experienced yet to wipe out their systems, right? I mean, Rich is really very forthcoming about anything that goes off in his aquarium.
Rich Ross. Rich Ross.
And I don't have anything. I've got like a very simple system set up right now. But as I set up something bigger, I'll have my own stories about interesting new ways that I found to kill stuff. And I think that I probably actually have in the course of dabbling around and trying different things, I think I probably have killed stuff in some ways that other people probably have not.
So Craig, let's do a time check. I know you mentioned that you were potentially under a time constraint. What do we got left there for you?
I think I'm still okay for a while. My kid got fed, and I think he's happy. And I think Michelle I thought she was going to be not around at all, but she's here now, so we can keep going.
All right, cool. Yeah, because we've got some more questions about kalkwasser, and also we've got some questions about trace elements. I know we wanted to talk about trace elements and reef tanks. Just a couple more quick questions for you about kalkwasser. Alex Correa, hey Alex, what's happening? Okay, his question is, well, he's got several questions. Is the presence of aluminum in any kalkwasser a matter of any concern in the long run?
Yeah, that's a good question. Aluminum is one of the ions that can occur in seawater that I think we don't have as good a handle on as I wish we did. It could be of concern if your aquariums. So the actual soluble aluminum concentration in the ocean is really quite low, and that's because your sort of seawater is close to like this minimum solubility zone for aluminum. So low pH values, stuff gets protonated and it's more soluble, and at really high pH values, like in lime water, the form is more like an aluminum hydroxide complex. It's negatively charged, and that can be more soluble as well. So aluminum is one of the ions that can be solubilized in a vat of lime water. I think that once you put it in your aquarium, though, it should become insoluble pretty quickly. But that would be a potential point of concern. I don't know what the threshold is for concern on that particular parameter.
Okay. A couple more quick questions about lime water. What would you say is the best measure to determine the potency of kalkwasser? Would that be pH or conductivity? I've heard of using both to measure the potency.
It's probably whichever one is actually working correctly.
So either.
For
okay.
you, right? So conductivity can be wrong and pH can be wrong. Taking your pH probe out of your aquarium and shoving it into a vat of lime water is potentially not very good for the pH probe if you're precipitating calcium carbonate out on the junctions. So that could be problematic if you had your own, pH meter for that. That said, either one of them should be just fine if they're working properly.
Another question in terms of
I guess the conductivity, because it's a linear scale, might be a little bit easier for people to interpret than pH, which is on a log scale.
Gotcha. What about the best delivery system for lime water? You've got calc stirrers, you've got drums, and I'm currently using a couple of 30-gallon drums that I have the kalkwasser in, the RODI water. I put the kalkwasser powder in, I fill it up with the RODI water. I have a peristaltic dosing pump that draws on that drum, and it doses a certain amount of the saturated solution to my system. Versus using a calc stir. Would a calc stir, and would the calc stir, the common way to use one of those is to have like your auto top off RODI go through that, which can be problematic because if you have different evaporation rates depending on the time of the year, then that could increase some variability. But is that also a problem because of and I guess the way to get around that is maybe you do not use that method to replace all the evaporated water. You use a set amount, so you're not going to have that variability. But I guess my question for you is that with a calc stir, and if you're running RODI through the calc stir, is that diluting the solution more so than if you had a stationary drum where the solution is, as you would say, kind of like a settling solution? That was a
Well,
very long-winded question, but
no, that's fine.
yeah.
So the calc stirrer systems are, more dynamic and less settled. So the whatever solids impurities that are in the lime water that would have settled out are going to be flushed into the system with something like that. You know, I'm worried anytime somebody has like the top up of their system plumbed directly to their RODI, just because you've got potentially all the water in the water tower like aimed at your system in case there's a problem, and people wipe out their systems because of low salinity in that way all the time, and you'll wipe it out even faster if you've got a caulk stirrer, and you've got a leak in your system, and you have a volume target, right, for your auto top off. And so suddenly, the pH in your aquarium's 10 and everything's dead. Whereas if you were using settled lime, especially if you're just dosing a fixed amount of it every day for like pH control, or because that's about how much you want to use, right? Those things aren't going to happen to you. So any time that it's a live system with potentially, thousands, millions of gallons of stuff aimed at your aquarium, you got to think about that really carefully, as opposed to a vat with a pump in it, and all this is kind of like by gravity below where it goes into your aquarium, so it's not going to siphon into your aquarium. It has to be very on purpose, when it goes in, as opposed to, whoops, there's a problem with there's a leak or something like that, and then you've got all kinds of problems. So, I'm like a really old school kind of guy, and we used a lot of settled lime water, and we were pretty happy about it, and we generally didn't kill our aquariums with it when we did it that way. If people want to do, other things, then again, you just got to understand fully what you're signing up for when you implement something like that in your aquarium.
And when you say settled lime water, you're talking about not having a pump to stir that solution around every now and then. You're talking about just putting some lime in the drum, filling it up, and
so you could intermittently stir the lime water. For example, you could stir it up during the day when you're not dosing lime water, because you're using lime water for pH control and carbon dioxide neutralization at night. So you can make sure that it stays saturated. But in a 30-gallon, one of those white brute, food grade polyethylene containers with a lid on it, lime water will last a long time and stay pretty concentrated. And again, you can measure that empirically. You could feel like you should be stirring it up or be afraid that its concentration is going down, but it's trivial to measure. And another way that you didn't mention that you can actually assess the concentration of lime water is you can do a calcium test on it if you dilute it down as well. You can do an alkalinity test on it as well. So there's a lot of ways of getting at the concentration in addition to pH and conductivity. And if you do those things during the life cycle of 30 gallons a couple times, you may convince yourself that the concentration really only goes down to 20% by the time you're at the end, and that's something that you can live with without, introducing more complexity and points of failure into the system by stirring it every 24 hours or something.
Gotcha.
So calcium, whenever you stir a suspension of chemicals, they can be abrasive. It can kill your power head or stir bar. You can have the stir bar burn a hole in the bottom of the container. your power head may be like getting kind of like savaged by the particles, and then it's shedding all kinds of stuff into your lime water that you don't like, rare earth elements and whatever else comes out of dying power heads, right? And it just may not be worth it for the improvement in saturation that you achieve. So I never did that, right? So I knew how much the concentration of lime water would go down in my dosing basin, and I just made the decision that it wasn't worth adding any more complexity.
Gotcha. I'm seeing some calls for people to hit the like button. Yes, please hit that like button so so more people can find the stream. That would be awesome. It's a very engaging, interesting discussion. So, Craig, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about trace elements. Another question that Alex had was, please let us know what trace elements we should be serious to dose, or is that necessary at all? So I guess you know there's kind of a couple questions within that one question, and that is, do we need to be dosing certain types of trace elements to a reef tank on a regular basis, or will regular water changes, will that suffice to replenish trace elements? And then I guess the next part of that question is, what trace elements should we be most concerned about in terms of adding to the tank?
So I've never really thought of water changes as a suitable mechanism for trace element replenishment, because by definition they're present at trace concentrations in seawater. The ones that we care about are often under biological control. They're actively depleted in seawater by our organisms, otherwise we wouldn't care about them, right? And so, like alkalinity, the amount of iron in an aquarium can go downhill really fast over the course of the day, and ditto with some of the other elements as well. If you're not intentionally maintaining much higher than typical levels in seawater, just for the purpose of being able to measure them, right? So there was a limit of detection issue with ICP for a number of biologically relevant elements, and I think that there was some suggestion that people kind of keep them higher than I think that they probably ought to be, just so you could see them in their tests, and they could say that they measured them. So the elements that okay, so then there's a group of people who feel like these things can be well supplemented chemically, and then there's another group of people who say, you know, all the essential elements that we might think about dosing are probably also present in food, right? So if it's an element that fish care about or corals care about, it's probably coming in, with the exception of the mineral needs of the system, to some degree in the food that you're adding to the aquarium. So there's some exceptions to that. So the stuff that you may be getting at least enough of by feeding the system are the ones that are the elements that are involved in metabolic processes like iron, enzyme cofactor metals, maybe zinc as well, copper. You have to have a certain amount of copper. Almost all biological systems need some copper, and manganese and the whole first row transition elements, and then so along those lines, if people are dosing trace elements, I think that the feeling has been that ICP testing allowed us to figure out what was going on, as far as how much trace elements that we needed to dose. And that's not exactly true, actually. So there's some colorimetric chemistry for iron and copper that are really sufficient and useful to monitor the levels that are present in reef aquariums. So Hawk has a ferrozyme test kit for iron that goes down to 1 part per billion. And you can kind of see your human eye is like really quite a sensitive photometric equipment as far as, you know, finding traces of color. You can probably even eyeball it even lower than that. And copper, there's a porphyrin method that's good down to, I think, 100 parts per. It's 0.1 ppb, so it's 100 parts per trillion, I guess. So those are ultra sensitive methods, and with those I was able to recover measurable copper and iron in almost all of the reef tanks that I would look at that were healthy, functional, you know, thriving reef tanks. I'd find, you know, a few parts per billion of colorimetrically measurable iron in the aquarium. And then if you have like a trace element supplement that has kind of like more or less the right stuff in it, you might be able to tell if you're having an adequate amount of trace elements around just by measuring iron.
Why? Oh, go ahead.
That assumes that we know what that kind of like the extended Redfield ratio is for the demand in the aquarium, and then we can watch one of those and know that everything else is going in approximately the right ratios. That assumes that people know what the right ratios are, and I would hope that the people who are making trace element supplements have some idea about what that is. But you know, you never know in the aquarium world, because there's some people who just have like they're just so bold, you know. they're willing to like put some stuff out there that's just not very well. The foundation for it is not as solid as one might hope. But with a well-regarded trace element supplement, you actually might be able to watch that with a sensitive colorimetric test. There's some other elements that are really hard to test for that are interesting to me, and I don't know how interesting they are to other people. So when I was doing the like element of the month stuff for Aquarium Frontiers, and I intended that to go on for longer than I kind of like had to like actually finish up my projects and stuff like that at work. So I had to take a hiatus from the aquarium world for a while. But I marched through the halogens. And so I did fluoride, and chloride I didn't talk about because there's just so much of it in seawater that, you know, I don't think anyone's reef aquarium is likely to suffer from chloride deficiency, salinity. We call that not having enough salt in your aquarium, right? But also, so fluoride, bromide, and iodide. And there's some interesting stuff going on with all of those potentially. And I don't know that people have like integrated fluoride into supplements or not. It can be toxic. And if I was a manufacturer, I wouldn't necessarily really be wild about shipping out a 1 molar fluoride solution and having people keep it under their aquariums where their kids can get into it and stuff like that, because it can, you know, it can be really bad if they drank some of that. So that's one that could be frankly toxic, but is also depleted very rapidly from aquariums. So I measured that, and I think that it was, you know, the half-life was in the range of a week or less.
Fluoride.
For the system, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, you know, the question I wanted to ask you is, you know, whenever I do ICP tests, and I hear this a lot from a lot of reef keepers in terms of iron, it's always showing up as 0, it seems like. And that you know, you talked about how quickly it can be depleted in a reef aquarium. Can you get into trouble by trying to get iron levels to show up in a test, and by overdosing iron? Is that something to be concerned about?
So I don't. So what? So ICP is such a funny thing, right? So I've never quite figured out what people are doing with their samples, our samples that we send to them, and for elements like iron, which is just not very soluble in seawater, we're sending a sample that's super saturated with respect to calcium carbonate. And it may start dropping minerals in the tube on the way to be ICP tested. And one of the things that's going to come down with the calcium carbonate is iron. And so it will tend to strip what's there. Some of the iron is probably present in organic complexes as well. And then there's the limit of detection for various transition elements with the different systems. So the optical emission spectroscopy ICP is not as sensitive as the mass spec is for metals. But because there's so much uncertainty in, like, how do you work up my sample when I send it to you? Do you acidify everything in the tube? In which case, I think you're gonna recover all the metals that I send to you that are at least not in bacteria. If bacteria grow and you filter the sample, is that going to remove metals? Well, people are adding, organic stuff to their systems, and you can get some bacterial growth, in seawater. If you put seawater in a bucket, kind of like, it'll be a little slimy after a while, right? And that's a bacterial film, and it's grown off of whatever was present in the water, and bacteria need iron. And so the bacterial growth in the tube on the way to be ICP tested could also deplete the iron in the sample as well. I'm frankly a little surprised that people aren't seeing iron in their aquariums, because I saw it colorimetrically a long time ago at levels comparable to ICP testing. And I do believe that method, because there's really only one thing in the world that turns that particular compound pink, and that's iron. So it was in the water. But, I was taking those samples, and I was taking it out of the aquarium, and I was doing the test right there. So all this other weird stuff that happens in transit was not going to happen with those tests. The limitation on the colorimetric stuff is that there may be metals that are tied up in extremely tight complexes. So iron is a very important element, and algae and other bacteria will make these siderophilic molecules that bind iron with like picomolar affinity, and then they're big, and then the organism has an uptake mechanism for that iron complex organic that it's made, and so they can take it up at really effectively. Now, if your colorimetric test can't pry it out of a complex like that, then you would underrepresent the amount of total iron that's in the system with a colorimetric test, whereas an ICP test should basically pyrolyze everything, and you should see all the iron that's actually present in the system with a test like that. So I think ICP it's really cool that people are doing that, and that methodology is available to people. I do think that there are some limitations to it that are probably not completely appreciated, and a lot of those are related to what happens to the sample, between my aquarium and the point and time when it's analyzed.
So what I'm hearing from you is that time in transit, the longer the time in transit, the potential there is that that could impact the validity of the data the longer it's in transit.
It really depends on how the sample's worked up, right? So if I acidified all the samples, and then I put all that stuff into the ICP. I think I might be able to recover stuff even if it was originally tied up in bacteria. Maybe. I don't know. I haven't, like, I did a little bit of ICP a while ago, and it was just like taking too much of my time to go over and use the instrument on a regular basis. So I can't answer these questions definitively, but actually, Rich Ross and I think Chris Smoppin read a great article when the ICP testing stuff started coming out, and that's a good thing to read, just to kind of like look at, think about it critically, and not just believe, you know, these numbers because they're coming out of a really expensive machine. You've got to have good sampling technique to get, and you've got to actually, you have to pose the question properly, right? And have the samples prepared accordingly to get the answer that you want.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of options out there for ICP testing, and what can make it even more confusing is that you could send out samples, the same sample, to several different ICP, you know, testing companies, and come back with some kind of pretty different results for certain elements.
Yeah, just kind of like see above, right? So they may have different procedures for handling the samples once you get them, and when you're not in the calcium or magnesium regime anymore, where there's like a lot of this stuff in the water. A little bit of biological uptake in the tube can dramatically change the amount of metals that are actually still in solution.
Even, you know, I find phosphate can be a very difficult parameter to measure, even via an ICP test. You know, I've gotten very different results for phosphate from different ICP test providers, and you know, even like the hobby grade test kits, it can be a little frustrating. You know, why is phosphate such a tough element to measure and get a handle on in this hobby?
So phosphate is another one of these elements that can be affected by precipitation. So it will come out with calcium carbonate. So you may be precipitating some inorganic phosphorus in the tube that's not measured on the way to the ICP facility. You know, or one place may do a really good job of getting all the stuff up, and so the numbers are higher than you expect them, and they may even be higher than you measure with your hobby test kits. But your hobby test kits are probably only measuring inorganic phosphate, so PO4 ions in solution. But there's a lot of other forms that phosphorus is present in the dissolved in water, so it can be tied up in organics as well. So there's like phospholipids, nucleotides, all other kinds of stuff can have phosphorus on them that will not be measured by your hobby test kit, but that phosphorus is potentially quite accessible to microbes, algae, bacteria in your system. So they know how to liberate the phosphorus and do with it as they wish, because that's what they're doing, right? That's how they get it. If it turned out that, you know, oh well, we use a phosphorus atom one time, we put in an organic molecule, and that's it. You know, life would have been, you know, not existed on the planet Earth. So they're very good at breaking into this stuff. So when I did measurements of phosphorus a long time ago, and I was using live samples, like samples that I just collected, and I do a total phosphorus measurement and an inorganic phosphorus measurement, there was always, the total phosphorus was always at least a factor of 2 or 3 higher than the inorganic phosphate. So there's a bunch of organic phosphate in our systems. And so if you, for example, sent a sample out for ICP analysis and the phosphorus was higher than you measured with your hobby test kit by a small factor, then I might actually think that you're both right. So you're measuring inorganic phosphorus and the ICP is measuring total phosphorus as it should, and you've gotten some extra information about the system.
Gotcha. Manny's Reef, thank you so much for that super chat. Yeah, I'm not going to rap, and Dr. Craig is not going to be beatboxing for me. Maybe if you add a few zeros to that super chat, then maybe that might happen. But I appreciate it, though, Manny's Reef. Really appreciate it. Couple more quick questions, Craig, and I'm going to let you go. One is, all right, talking about minors and trace elements in terms of dosing that to a reef tank. What about the use of macro, for nutrient control, right? You got algae scrubbers, your refugiums, algae reactors, what have you, to help control the nitrates and the phosphates. But is that macro pulling out those minors and traces that you really want to keep in the system? Are you kind of like defeating the purpose in terms of doing that, or are the benefits of using macro going to can you get around those negatives in terms of using macro and what it would be pulling out of the system by dosing those traces?
I mean, any bioassimilation kind of export mechanism that you've got, so it could be a turf scrubber, algae, it could be macroalgae, it could be the diatoms on your glass that you swipe off and they go into your skimmer and your skimmer pulls them out, which is another. All that stuff is going to pull not just nitrogen and phosphorus out of the system, but it's going to pull iron and all the other biologically important trace elements out as well. So I don't think that it's a unique problem with any particular bioassimilation export technique. It's common to all of them, and the answer is that you just have to make sure that you don't run out of iron or whatever it is, that manganese or whatever else that might wind up being limiting in your system, because that's going to have, if you are driving algal growth in your system, they're competing for the same pool of those elements as the symbiotic algae in your corals and your coralline algae are, right? So if they're running out, then everything else is running out in your tank as well, and that's not a good thing.
So if you're using algae and for that purpose in terms of using macro, would you recommend dosing trace elements?
I think that you just about have to.
Yeah. Okay. One last question for you. Activated carbon, using that 24/7, good or bad? Not a simple answer.
So there's a lot of different kinds of carbon, and there's a lot of different intensities of carbon use. So the amount of carbon that you've got on per water volume. I think that you can have a successful reef aquarium and have activated carbon in the system all the time. I think that you can have a successful system and use it somewhat more intermittently as well, but I don't think that there's anything intrinsically bad about having some carbon on your aquarium all the time, any more than like skimmers pull potentially good stuff out of the water as well. And so should you turn your skimmer off sometimes? I don't know. Maybe, but you can have a good aquarium with a skimmer that runs all the time. If you're using carbon, it depends on how episodically people are using carbon. If it goes too long in between carbon applications, you can actually get a lot of yellow stuff building up in the water,
right?
And have that change the light transmission of the water in the system pretty dramatically. So you've got to be careful when you've got a lot of yellow water in your tank, to kind of, I think, go slow and get rid of that, unless, of course, it's like there's some emergency and you feel like there's something toxic in the water, you just have to get it out as soon as possible. But in that case, if you pull a lot of yellow color out of the water really fast, you might have to dial back on the lights a little bit to keep from shocking your corals.
Gotcha. Well, listen, Craig, I want to thank you so much for joining us here tonight. Really appreciate you taking the time and yeah.
It's been fun.
Yeah, no, I'm
thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you being on, and would love to have you back on down the road. I got tons of other stuff to ask you. So that's going to do it for the show. I want to again thank Craig for being on today's live stream, and I also want to thank both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine for being sponsors of this show, and also want to thank all you folks out there for tuning in and watching and contributing to the chat. It was great. Also, a big thank you to Paul, who's the moderator, as well as the president of the Boston Reefer Society. Please join and support your local reefing clubs. They are so important to this hobby. Also want to let you know that all episodes of Rappin with ReefBum are available as podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Amazon. My next Rappin with ReefBum live stream will be next Thursday, July 6th, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Sonny Harjali. I probably butchered Sonny's name. I'm going to make sure I get it right when I have him on next week. Some actually might remember Sonny's rimless reef tank. I think it was Sonny X on the forums. So he's certainly a very talented reef keeper. I'm going to look forward to having him on the show next week. Should be another great one. If you want to check out the full upcoming schedule of guests, visit reefbum.com under the YouTube section. So until then, be safe and be well. Later.